No, as well.
No, I like
I
it, but it's
like it.
just it
Yeah.
makes life harder a little bit.
Yeah.
Considering, yeah,
Mhm.
that's right.
Okay, so you're there twice.
Yeah, oh, there you go.
Oh, perfect.
Okay. Um, so what I wanted to talk about, why I wanted to share the screen, I wanted to start off with a quick, just a quick mention that I put up the instructions for the final essays. In case you hadn't seen it, I put it up on Studium. The creative essay is pretty much as I described. I just put it in words, and you'll see that it's a little bit more extensive than the instructions that I put up for the regular essay if you decide to go that route, just because I figure that the regular essay is more standard. You are used to it relatively by now, right? What goes into a literary essay. Right? If you do need more discussion of this or want to discuss it more, I'm happy to, but I'm not expecting like you to reinvent the wheel necessarily if you go with the regular essay. I'm just looking at it now. Here we go. So yeah, if ever you're looking for it in Studium, it's at the very bottom of the Studium after week 13. I put both categories there. The final paper instructions themselves are in the kind of depot box, right, or deposit box that you can give in. And you'll notice that, yeah, I put a kind of arbitrary deadline, right? I put December 23rd by 5 p.m. It's a very like I said, arbitrary cutoff. I'm flexible on this, right? If you're finishing off and it's like 5 p.m. and you're just lacking two paragraphs or anything like that, I'm not gonna not accept it because it's late or anything like that. It's I just have to put a deadline, so that's very randomly. Same thing goes for just extensions. I do have a deadline for when I can give in the final grades. I think it's beginning of January or something like that. So as long as the extension that you request, if that is the case, as long as the extension that you request is reasonable, I'm happy to grant it to you. Um, yeah, but that's pretty much that. Um, yeah, I just wanted to start off with that. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about the final assignment? I know we haven't even actually none of you have given in the like short critical readings yet, which is fine. But we're already talking about the finals. But does anyone have any questions or concerns?
Not for
Yep.
now, but if we have some, just send you an email about it because I know I'll forget at this point.
Yeah, it's fine. Um, okay. No problem at all. So, in that case, let me close up the Studium. There is other admin stuff that we're going to get to, but it'll make more sense to talk about it next week. So we're not going to do that just yet. Okay, so two things that I asked you to read for today. One, Frankenstein in a Swamp, basically. And two, a bit of a longer essay, which is fine if you didn't have time to read the entirety of the Karen Barad text. It is a 30-page essay, right? That is quite dense, of course, which I warned you about. She's a theoretical physicist by trade, so it's not exactly within our literary wheelhouse, formally speaking. But I still think she offers quite a bit, not only for reading Moore's Swamp Thing, but also she has been shockingly influential in what we broadly call kind of planetary studies, or even some of its kind of theoretical subgroups that we call new materialism, which we can maybe get into that whole distinction, but it may not be super relevant to get into for today. But did we actually have a chance to at least skim through the Karen Barad text on post-human performativity? Liani, no. Alicia, kind of. Marcio, yes. Okay, so 3 levels of of engagement. And how about the swamp thing? Did we manage to read that? Okay, good, 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 good. So what did we gather? As usual, we'll kind of start with the theoretical element just to be on the same footing. So what did we gather from the Barad text from what we have read, right? What are some of the key terms? What are some of the key concepts that jumped out at us or came to mind?
Permission to speak, sir.
You do not have, okay, even if it is on Zoom, stop. Just don't.
Okay, I'm just messing with you. So as you mentioned there, that text it was really complicated to understand. The theory is deeper than I thought. But regarding terms that we have there the materialism, we have the conception of representalism. How do you say that big word here? Representationalism, something like that, right?
Exactly.
And I understood this text here as we have the tendency that deliver to the language the explanation of the matter. And that what it matters now, because we are just considering what the matter really is, and we are much more like influenced by what language represents to us. And
Right.
that's the kind of idea I got from this complex text here.
Good. Um, anything else that came to mind? Leonie, I know you didn't read it, so that's fine if you don't answer. But Alicia, anything else that came to your mind? But yes, Marcio, you're absolutely correct of what you were saying, and we'll elaborate on that.
And we talked, if I remember correctly, about how um matter is not exactly active, but like more passive in a way. From what I understood, that's
It's the other way around.
the other way around. Okay. So from what I remember, that was one of the points that the author was trying to make.
So,
Well,
so
obviously
she was,
I mixed it, but
yeah, she was arguing against the view of matter as passive. You're right that she brought it up, but her argument was based on the opposite. Yeah.
perfect. That's fun. That's basically what I remember from the text.
Right. Okay. Good. So um, we'll start there. So it might seem odd to it might seem odd in a literature class, right, like this one, to give you a text that is basically saying words have been overused, right? To put it in like very simple and punchy terms. But I think I don't think Barad would say that words and literature or narratives are inherently a wrong thing to do, right, or to use. Obviously, right, as someone who communicates through papers like the one you read, or who just exists in the world, she uses words and terms. And so she wouldn't go so far as to say that these words or this act of representationalism, as Marcio, you pointed up, is something that we should altogether ignore, right? What she's talking about, right, and this she mentions right in the very first paragraph, right? It seems to be symptomatic, it being the primacy of words, seems to be symptomatic of the extent to which matter of fact has been replaced with matters of signification, right? So, what are the facts of the world versus how we actually engage with them in a way that is, to Barad at least, dissociated through words, right? We're kind of separating ourselves from the concrete realities of the world, from matter, right? And we can get to what Barad means as matter in a second, right? From matter with the basic wall, if you will, or basic separation of words that are stand-ins, right, for what actually exists. Okay. But then she goes on to say, right, language matters, discourse matters, culture matters, all of these actually do matter. But we cannot basically basically make these things superior to our engagement with the material world in and of itself. Um, so far, so good. Did I lose anyone? Okay, good. Um, it is sometimes a little bit complicated to address these kind of new materialist thinkers because they they are often people who came in from outside the humanities, right? So the terms that they use are not necessarily ones that we in the humanities would tend to gravitate towards. Barad is a bit of an exception for this because she explicitly references people oh shoot, what's her name? Butler, Judith Butler, who's a kind of classic at this point in the humanities. She also references people like Nietzsche, and if I remember correctly from this article, the granddaddy of humanities in the postmodern world, right? Michel Foucault, who no matter how much we want to, we can never seem to escape, right? So she does kind of engage with these humanities powerhouses, right? Especially Butler with the whole concept of performativity. But again, she kind of brings it back to her lens that she's used to in physics. And this is what she's talking about when she's talking about matter, right? Obviously, at some points in the text, she kind of plays on the two meanings that we have for matter. She does a kind of Derridian move where she constantly interchanges and interplays between one meaning of matter as something of import, right, and something of relevance, and matter as in, the things that we can feel and are constituted of, right, the atoms of our being. Now, Barad, both here and elsewhere, basically encompasses everything as matter, right? She will talk about atoms, right? Right down to like its most basic fundamental building blocks of the universe, right? Type of thing. All the way to the shirt I have on my body right now, right? All of this can constitute matter. Our human bodies constitute matter. The cat that just walked on my steps is matter, right? All of it. Okay? So why so why do I bring this up, right? Like, what relevance does this have to the world around us or to our purposes here in literature? Well, for one, I'm sure that you've already started to kind of see, if you've read Swamp Thing, some of the reasons why I'm bringing this up, of course. But I do think that her engagement with the notion of performativity is a really interesting one to unpack, perhaps. So we unpacked a little bit the second half of her title in Posthumanist a little bit last week, right, when we made the distinction between posthuman and transhuman. And I asked you to kind of think through what exactly Swamp Thing was. Was it transhuman or posthuman and so on? So we can come back to that. But for now, I want to spend a little bit of time on the second half of that title, right, of performativity. So how did you understand her use of performativity? And hint, it is more than just acting on a stage, right? Like, yes, we all perform on stage as actors, for example, but it obviously goes a little bit beyond that, right? So again, Marcio or Alicia, I'm curious how you, if at all, understood her use of performativity. Right? And this relates back to Judith Butler, of course, who is where she takes this term from. Do you want me to repeat the question? So it's a simple question. Well, how does Barad use the term performativity in this article? Right? Like, what does it mean to her?
That should be the way we have to avoid the influence of language in order to understand matter better? The the idea, the conception of performativity is
Hmm.
something like that. I don't quite follow exactly.
Yeah. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? I think you're onto something, right? But unpack that a little bit. I think you're really close there. Yeah.
Well, because according to the text here, it seems like the language is has this such bad influence on matter, and performativity is the way we are actually digging out from this kind of bad influence to get the proper meaning of the matter. Is that
Right.
the idea of this?
In part, absolutely, right? I think that's definitely a good way to think of it. Especially, I like the use of the term "getting out of." You can very much frame performativity as a doorway through which to bridge that gap that is created by language, right? And again, right, you use the term negative here, language. Language, again, for Barat has a place, right? But seeing it as the sole arbiter of meaning is where she has a problem, right? So, good. Performativity as a kind of doorway into understanding matter. I like that, right? Alicia, do you want to add anything to that? How you maybe understood it?
Honestly, I had trouble understanding the text, but I feel like she also talked about how we, like Marshall said, how we need to get out of the language part and focus on
Mhm.
the actions and like the what's the word? Activities. It's still hard to explain for me because I had difficulty understanding it.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's like we need to the actions we do are the performativity. It's
yeah.
kind of what I understood, but in
Good.
a
Yeah, yeah.
very complicated way to me.
Okay, so this is where we get into. But and you might have seen this. I don't know because I know you're taking the the modern literary theory course, right? You might have seen that as part of that course as well, maybe.
I did talk about Karen Barat's concept in Harding's class.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so
She's
I have an idea a little bit of what we're talking about. I read
okay. Good.
a chapter from Stacia Limo, Bodily Nature,
Good.
where she talks
Um,
about her.
no, please. Um, so the idea of performativity, like we said, is kind of inevitably tied to Butler, and Butler specifically took it up. Judith Butler specifically took it up with the idea of gender, right? Um, that was her perspective on it. Writing in the early '80s and in the '90s, she was very interested, and even still to this day, she produces books every so often on this. But she was very interested in the distinction, as a lot of third wave feminists were, in the distinction between sex and gender. Okay, which is now like a big hot button issue for a lot of conservatives who are like seeing it as this huge moral panic for whatever reason. But mostly it's because people kind of misunderstand and overblow what Butler is trying to say, right? So for Butler, there's a distinction between sex, right? How you're born, right? Just biological male female type of stuff, and gender, which is where the performativity comes in. And the idea that you enact the body that you are basically interested in being. Okay. So we can take a super simple example here. As you've probably assumed correctly, right? I am a cis male, right? I was born this way and I haven't changed my body since I was born, right? Like I am exactly as I look like. Okay. But my way of performing my masculinity, for example, is very different than the way my dad does, right? Just a generation ago, and very different from the way my grandfather did 2 generations ago. and certainly different from, I don't know, a man in 18th century, um, England or whatever. Okay. So all of these ways that we adopt and perform, right, our gender roles is what interests Butler. Okay. Um, Now, this is not a class on gender, so we're not going to spend like so much time on it, right? But needless to say that the point is we do more than we are more than just beings, right? Facts of nature, right? The very construction of who we are is very much how we build ourselves, right? And I made the joke that it's not the same as acting on a stage, but in a way it is similar to how we act on a stage, right? We're still the same person when we act on a stage, if you've ever done theater, but you put on certain affects in order to give the illusion of being another character. And we all do that in our day-to-day lives. Okay? Marcio, go ahead. Yeah.
So performativity here means that let's just say you are an actor, an analogy here, and you have some kind of formation. And if you are supposed to perform another kind of, let's just say another play, and you are in the field of performativity, that's the thing.
Okay, so the acting example that I gave is, I guess, a metaphor.
Okay.
The performativity for Butler, and we'll get to how Barad adapts it in a sec. Performativity for Butler is basically how you are in life, right? Where you are constantly performing expectations that you set for yourself or expectation that others have of you.
I
Okay?
see.
So the acting part, an actor does it temporarily. They set on stage, they're performing for 2 hours, and then they leave, and they're back to being their like assumed self. Okay? Where Butler's performativity comes in is to say, on a daily basis, everyone performs certain expectations of, for her, gender gender standards, gender expectations, right? Women are expected and men are expected or think they are expected to act a certain way in 21st century society, for example. Okay? That is the performativity. Okay? It is both imposed and assumed, but it is a performance that is meant to set the standards of what we expect for ourselves. Um, does that clarify a little?
Yeah, this is supposed to be imposed to us in order to perform, or we are actually that comes from inside of us?
Both.
Both.
I think Butler is basically saying both. Yeah. Um, so there is, yeah, just to give another example. So I gave the example of men. Just to give another example. So for my mother's generation, there would have been a certain expectation of performing femininity in a certain way, right? So my mother was born in the late 50s, right? And so there would have been expectations for her to wear certain clothes, right? And even act in a certain way because these things were expected of her, right? Especially as someone who was raised in a rural community, which tended to be a little bit more conservative than, say, urban communities. Okay? But she also had her own vision of herself and how she actually wanted to perform some of the standards of her life, right, or of her femininity. And so I think for Butler, and this is again probably simplifying many, many books that she wrote on this, what you're interested in performativity is an interplay of those two things, right? Both imposed norms or expected norms and personal norms. Okay. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Um, we can have a whole debate as to whether or not we agree with Butler and like the whole like the whole details of her affairs. That's not really relevant for us right now. Basically, Barad is saying that's great and all, Butler's right. But let's expand this outward even more, right? She's expanding this not just to the field of gender, as Butler was interested in and is still interested in, but into the field of matter, right? Into the field of everything, essentially, right? Where the atoms, right, that constitute our world and our universe, right, act and perform in a certain way, right? And this is where the beauty of quantum physics comes in, which I'm certainly not well enough equipped to like delve into the details of. But I'm paraphrasing essentially Barad here. But where atoms have been found to actually act in ways that we wouldn't necessarily expect, right? And they act in relation to other atoms, right? And the further along you go, right, the more you realize that every single level of matter, from atoms to the cat, I gave us an example earlier, does some kind of performance in relation to one another. And Barad uses this as a jumping off point to essentially coin her new term, which you read in this article, which is intra-action. Okay, I saw some shifty looks there. Do we all remember that term in the in the article? Yeah. Okay. So intra-action is to be distinguished from inter-action, and it's essentially Barad's fancy way of saying that for her, when we say interaction, we're assuming that the things that are interacting, whether it's human or non-human, have just begun existing in that moment, right? Whereas intra-action is a concept for her. I wrote it down here in a really, yeah, that the existence of things that act among themselves, right, does not pre-exist any kind of action, right? You only exist based on your action with other things, so on and so forth, right? Which highlights the whole performativity thing. So because everything performs with itself and with other things at all times, when you're actually deliberately engaging with something new, right, on a, say, me interacting with all of you, or me interacting with my cat in the morning when I feed him, it is a form of intra-action, right, because we are actually constituting ourselves through our actions and through our performance of one another. Hence why she thinks that matter is so important, okay? Because to her, it is literally the foundation of how we are in the world, right? It's not enough to say that I am a teacher or I am a cat owner. I have to actually enact it and be that thing and intra-act with students, cats, the food that I feed my cat, etc. And all of these separate things have their own actions and performances, and you can go on that ad infinitum. Okay. Yeah, I wasn't expecting to talk about like deep quantum physics at 8:30 in the morning on a Tuesday, but here we are. That is the nature of our world, I guess. Do we have any questions about this so far? Totally fine if yes. It is hard as a concept, of course.
According to what you have just stated there, you gave this example that it's not enough to say that I'm a teacher. I have to act as such.
Yes. Right. So, go ahead. Actually, I
No,
didn't
no,
want to cut you
no.
off.
That's the thing. So if I call myself a teacher and I don't act as a teacher, I can't be called as a teacher. That's the point. Even
Yeah, I would
even
say
I
so.
think I am a teacher, but I have to be recognized by someone else in order to get this title.
Either recognized, you know, I can call myself a teacher as much as I want,
Mm-hmm.
right? And this is where the representationality comes in at the start of the essay I recommended you.
Uh-huh.
So I could say I'm a teacher and write it on my CV if I want, right? If none of my if none of my credentials actually prove that, if I don't have experience in it, for example, and if none of my students actually learn anything, right, and they just refuse to actually participate in class or are completely unaware of what I'm actually talking about or hate me for whatever reason, right? Like there's any kind of number of things that can happen here. Then no matter how much I use the word teacher, am I actually existing and performing as a teacher, right? And that's kind of like where some of those distinctions come in. It's maybe not the best example because it gets us away from the concept of matter, but that's kind of how I understand it. Go ahead, Lynn.
Is it like, for example, if you were to say you're a mechanic,
Mm-hmm.
like you use the term, you use the language to represent something, to like represent yourself as a mechanic, but um, until you actually perform like mechanical duties,
Mm-hmm.
or like you like perform the title you're giving yourself, that's when you fall into like performativity.
Yes, absolutely. Right.
Okay.
I would say that's definitely true. And that's a good example because I can use it on myself perfectly. I have absolutely said in my life, yeah, I'm I'm good with my hands, right? Again, enacting the expectations that, you know, we have of men in the 21st century that, yeah, you need to be good with your hands type of thing. And like, I know how to fix a car. Fuck, I've never owned a car in my life. I have no idea what I would actually do if I opened up the hood of a car, right? Like, I would just stare at it and wait until it actually fixed itself, if that were actually the case, right? So there is a level of distinction here between actually enacting and intra-acting, to bring it back to Barad's concept, right? And saying certain things. Okay. Go ahead.
Um,
Yeah.
so basically, you're like, as you said at the beginning of class, it's she kind of like critiques our use of language in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
and like we use it in a more representational
Yeah.
way, um, talking about even like um, matters such as like landscapes and the nature and stuff, but ourselves as well, and we need to like bridge the gap,
Yes.
kind of thing. Okay.
I think that's absolutely fair. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Um, Again, you can probably start to make connections here between this concept and Swamp Thing, which we're going to talk about more formally after our first break, just because it'll make more sense to kind of do it then. But the idea of nature is a good example to use here, and it's why a lot of planetary and eco-critical thinkers have picked up on this idea, right, of intra-action. So let's kind of use this as an example going forward. So some of you may have noticed that recently our federal government, has recently dropped a budget, right? If you didn't, don't worry about it. It's brutally boring to read budgets, right? It's 400 pages of math. Awful. But it does give a good example of what we're talking about here, where our current government campaigned on, um, at least partially, the idea of ecological practices for the Canadian state, right? Investing in green energies, that type of stuff. Okay, encouraging Canadians to buy more electric vehicles or whatever the hell, right? You can kind of go on and on and on. So here we have the level of representation, right? The words that the politicians during the campaigns were stating to us, right, were giving us images of some kind of like green, happy utopia for Canada, right? if you were the least bit cynical like myself, you maybe didn't see those images popping up in mind, but that was what they were meant to evoke, right? Is just we're going towards a brighter, greener future for Canada. Okay. In reality, right, the actions that they're actually performing, as evidenced by the latest budget, is actually cutting in any kind of green standards that we would have in Canada and giving huge subsidies to oil and gas companies once more. Okay. So here we have a literal action that people are performing, that governments are performing, that counteract and go against the representation that they actually stated previously. Now we can take this even further, okay, and stop me at any point if this becomes too much. This will, of course, change how we, as common citizens, interact with the world around us. Okay? So that if in my day-to-day life, right, despite me wanting to actually be greener in my everyday existence, right, the world around me, the matter that surrounds me, may not be conducive to such a thing, right? Where it becomes increasingly difficult for me to take public transit because it's not maintained and it's not expanded, and so I might need to actually get a car at some point in order to exist. Okay, I don't know if that's actually going to be true. I hope not, but we'll just use it for the sake of an example here. Okay. Now, in this example, each of these parties, myself and the world around me, the matter around me, are what Barad would call intra-actors. Each of these have its kind of history and its existence that formulates and creates that very relation, right? On the one hand, there's my willingness to want to be greener in my life, but also the fact that I live in Canada, which is a country that doesn't necessarily want to do that at all times. For the other side, in the world around me, we of course have the history and existence of governments, multinationals, car companies, just the planet on its own, right, acting in its own interesting ways, all of which kind of come together in order to make the world that I engage with and may or may not be able to change as much as I would like to, right? And so we have these kind of constant actions between each and every single element of this world that are kind of interplaying on each other like big atoms would, right? If you want to think of it in a more metaphorical sense, right? Atoms kind of interact with each other on a like microscopic level. And an atom, and this is the beauty of quantum physics, an atom on the other side of the universe might have an impact on an atom here, on my hair follicles, for example. And it's the same thing if you want to like macro it out on a planetary scale. Okay, one person's action or one rock's action, right, might have an impact somewhere else on the planet. Okay, and so it becomes, in that case, a whole interaction of matter, right? Which is why she's so willing in her article and elsewhere to attribute what we call agency to matter, right? When various elements in the world have such an impact on our daily existence, it's not that much of a stretch for Barad to say that a rock has an agency or that a tree has some kind of agency, right? And when I say agency, I mean the ability to act and the ability to almost think and engage with the world around it, right? So for her, all of this is connected in a kind of blown up version of how atoms would kind of work. I feel like I've gone crazy for a sec. Do we want to like stop and ask questions? It's okay.
You mentioned something that something is done here causes another effect in another part of the planet, just like the butterfly effect?
It is a kind of butterfly effect. Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of
It
complex
it is.
to
Yeah.
follow.
I never said it wasn't, but you can think of it. Okay, so I think I've given this example in class before, so we can kind of go with it, and it ties in, I guess, with today's literature. So do we all remember what was one of the major influences on Frankenstein as a piece of literature, right? Like ecologically speaking, I briefly mentioned it.
Did we?
Maybe you weren't there, Marcio. That's very possible, so it's okay if you don't remember. I think it was like very early on in the class. So in 1818, well, it would have been a little bit earlier at this 1816, there's a volcano that erupted. Okay. Not in England where Mary Shelley was writing. Okay. Well, she was writing in Geneva, but whatever. Not in Europe where Mary Shelley was writing Frankenstein, but in Indonesia. Okay. Now, this volcano was so massive that it had an impact on the entirety of the planet. Right? It literally sent ash across the world. Okay. Now, this would not have been the only thing that influenced Frankenstein. There was a bunch of other things. But consider this. If suddenly, in the 19th century, right, you're good old Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein one dark and dreary night for a contest, and for the last months of the summer, all you've seen around you are these dark clouds of ash, right, that are basically covering the sky at almost all times. You have no idea where this comes from because it's the 18th century and communication is basically non existent, right? But you do know that it has an impact on everything that you consider to be your world, right? So, this is a really good example of how something that is literally on the other side of the planet for Shelley, right? England to Indonesia is as far away as you can possibly get, right? But it has an entire impact on the globe, right? And on the very way, for Shelley at least, that she's telling stories, right? Because she would have seen the armies of displaced farmers and agriculturalists who would have seen their crops devastated by this action, right? And it would have absolutely triggered in her mind like images of zombified people, right? Like this is a thing that we know of, right? And so all of this has like an impact not only on the planet, but on our imagination and on the soil, right? So one thing on one side of the planet absolutely impacts the other side. And yes, we can call it a butterfly effect, or however we want to qualify it. But this is 100% something that exists. And it doesn't have to be even naturally occurring events. None of you would have necessarily been alive. I wasn't. I don't know how old you are, Marcio, but Chernobyl might have been something that you would have, that you were at least aware of, right? Even if you didn't live through it, where a nuclear reactor exploded in Soviet Ukraine and literally had an impact across the globe, right? Because radiation was so massive that it kind of spread everywhere, at least on some level. It wasn't dangerous for most of the planet, of course, but it still had some kind of impact, right? So these kind of intra-connectivities, right, are very real, right? And I'm using big examples here, but it's not hard to imagine how these even small actions can have cumulative effects on the planet, our being, and our way of interacting with one another. Right? We'll come back to it in relation to Swamp Thing, but there's a reason why the story takes place, for example, I think there's a reason why the story takes place in Louisiana, right? And you might think back to the link that I put on Studium for week 1, right? So that might indicate some things of how these how these seemingly small or seemingly insignificant events can carry on and interact with a variety of things until they do have noticeable impacts. This is also something that you should keep in mind for next week. Alicia, I don't know if you've already started reading for next week for your presentation, but you can probably start to see things in relation to the slow violence that Rob Nixon is talking about, right? We'll talk about that, of course, when we get to it. But I don't know if that answered the question. I don't even remember what the question was, if there was a question. Okay.
It was the butterfly effect.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes. I think I answered that. Any other questions? Or things that we wanted to go off of? Okay. So just to give me a sense of where I'm going to head once we talk about Swamp Thing proper. So I know Alicia and Marcio last week, you said that you had never read Swamp Thing as a comic book before. Okay, good. Leonie, had you ever read or heard? Okay. Have any of you ever read anything by Alan Moore before? That might be because you might have read other stuff. Yeah, Marcio.
Actually, V for Vendetta counts.
Absolutely. Yeah, sure. He wrote it. So yeah, it would count.
I watched the motion picture and
Yes, a movie he famously did not like. As an, I think the movie is better than the book, but we can get to that. But I'm just asking because I think a little bit of context on him as an author. We're not going to spend too much time on it, but I think a little bit of context on him might be good, and I just wanted to get a sense of how much you knew of him or not going into it. So, diddly squat. Lovely. I'll just write that down then. Okay. So in that case, I think it's as good of a place, if no one has any questions, it's as good of a place to take a quick break. We'll kind of stop here before getting into Swamp Thing proper. I'll go fill up my water bottle, stretch my legs, and then we can pick up with a kind of continuation of this. Is that good for everyone? Wonderful. So come back in like, I guess, yeah, 5-10 minutes, and we'll start back. Alicia, that looks like a massive mug of tea or coffee that's just ungodly big.
It's just how it looks. It's
Oh,
actually
okay.
pretty
Sorry,
normal.
because I couldn't see like the bottom of
It's
it. It just looked massive in
my
your hand. Yeah. I'm definitely going to make myself some tea later. Just awful. Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Okay, so brief, yeah, just a bit of a brief context, I guess, for the publication of this book. So, as Marcia said, some of you may have been aware of Alan Moore as a kind of name, right? Mostly how a lot of contemporary readers are aware of him are through adaptations of his work that he thoroughly disavows, right? Mostly because he thinks that a lot of his comic book work, and he's written other stuff like novels, but most of his comic book work was written specifically for the medium of comic books. And kind of any adaptation of them can never quite capture what he was trying to say or do with that specific medium. You don't have to agree with Moore on this case. I think he's a very cynical man in many ways, and that makes it a little bit difficult to appreciate him as a person sometimes and his artistic vision. But he has still written some very good comic books and stories, and so I think he's well worth kind of unpacking. I just took a few examples here out of my shelves just for the sake of showing them. But yeah, some of you might have heard of the movie V for Vendetta or seen it. It's kind of become a cult phenomenon with the anonymous people, or the mask is used at protests sometimes. This was also published in the mid 80s, like Swamp Thing, and very much demonstrates Moore's interest in political activism and political criticism. The movie was made decades after the comic book came out and is a very different monster. The book is specifically an attack on what Moore saw as the excesses of Margaret Thatcher's time as Premier of the United Kingdom, where Alan Moore comes from. And the movie, of course, completely disowns that because it can't can't really address those same topics. It was made in like 2005, so obviously Thatcher was no longer prime minister at that point, and the world had kind of changed. In part because of people like Margaret Thatcher, but still the climate had changed. Yeah, V for Vendetta is an interesting example of his political interest, but I feel less of Moore's ability to kind of push the medium of comic books in the same way that he would with books like Swamp Thing, or what is probably his most known work and one of the greatest known comic books of all time, Watchmen. Right? Again, made in a movie. In this case, the movie I think is way less interesting than the comic book. So very, very different perspectives on adaptation there. So some of you, again, might have heard of Watchmen. It's one of those things that you often get assigned in a comic book class or a graphic novel class, if ever you take one of those. Some universities give them. I I don't think it's a good idea to ever do that personally, because not because it's a bad book. That's not what I'm saying. Is because it's very much a product of its time. The things that Watchmen was reacting to and reacting against in the whole industry of comic books have kind of been lost to time, and so reading it out of its context feels kind of weird to a lot of readers. Okay, but it is still interesting to kind of briefly introduce it and more, because when Watchmen came out, I think the first volume of it, or the first when did the first version of it, the first issue, 1985. So when it first came out in 1985, the comic book landscape was very, very different. It was still very much focused on flashy superheroes, right? Doing silly things in silly costumes, right? And it was starting to change, right? Comic books were starting to become a little bit more adult oriented and picking up themes that were meant for more mature readers. Drug abuse, complex characters, that kind of stuff, right? But more, yeah. Go ahead, Marcio.
You mentioned that Flash superheroes there, and it made me remember of the Boys, the TV series there.
Yes. Yeah.
That that,
Absolutely.
that the boys were actually inspired on the Watchmen or something like that.
Well, so that's the interesting thing. So we'll come back to the boys and why I think it's a bit weird to read Watchmen out of context now, right? But I think that's a really good example if you've all seen it. So Watchmen was very much a response to this kind of like flashy, happy-go-lucky, oh golly, Batman, we're gonna fight Mr. Freeze again, right? And wanting to take a more cynical outlook on how superheroes would quote unquote actually be in real life, right? And it had a kind of tendency of grounding these larger than life figures and saying, yes, they are fantastical, right? And they have these superpowers that make them like gods on Earth, but they also have their flaws, right? It kind of turned these superheroes into Greek myths in many ways, right? If ever any of you have read Greek myths, the gods in them have incredible abilities, but they're also great assholes at times, right? And they have flaws, right? No, but it's true, right? We laugh, but it's again, it's a cultural product. The Greeks wouldn't have seen it as a bad thing, right? But to us today, that's kind of how it plays out. And so reading Watchmen outside of this doesn't work as well, in part because of what Marcio is bringing up. We've gotten so used to this kind of grounded and down to earth version of superheroes, right, as being humans, right, with all their flaws, but also with all of their excesses of superpowers and so on, right, that it's just become normalized. And so we have TV shows like The Boys, which is not based on Watchmen, by the way. It is its own comic book series that was created by Garth Ennis, who I hate as an author. And but he's very much channeling that same idea of more, even if he's not adapting more specifically, right? Of saying, yeah, of course, if people had superpowers in real life, of course they would be jerks, right? So it's again this very dour look on humanity, right? Which can work, I think, in a vacuum. Right? This is not me dunking on Watchmen. I think it's a brilliant comic book in many ways, but it works as a flash in a pan thing. To sustain it for decades of storytelling is depressing, right? And the worst kind of cynicism. To me, you can absolutely disagree with me. I don't want to, Marcio, if you like The Boys, you used it as an example. If you like it, like, good for you. I find it bleak in the worst ways. But the reason why I bring up Watchmen is not only, again, as an example of what Moore is interested in, right? But also because it was very much hailed as a book that pushed the boundaries of what it meant to tell a story in comic book form, right? Because for very often, if any of you have read any like regular quote unquote comic books of just Tintin or Superman or whatever, right? There are limitations that are imposed, right? Limitations on the page, limitations on how much space you have, on how you tell a story, right? And Watchmen is very much credited with kind of pushing those boundaries, right? Playing with panel composition, playing with what kind of themes you introduce in books and so on and so forth, how you actually tell that story in a fashion that is not always linear or straightforward, right? But that uses the medium of comic books in order to push those envelopes itself. We don't have time to get into a whole lecture of like what makes Watchmen so special, but again, it was just kind of to introduce the basic principles of what Moore was interested in. And specifically, Moore was part of a generation in comic books that has been retroactively called the quote unquote British invasion, in a kind of cheeky reference to how the Beatles kind of invaded American pop culture in the 60s. You saw a similar thing with comic books in the 80s, where a lot of American publishers, like DC Comics and Marvel Comics, went to poach authors in Great Britain, right? And brought them in and had them revitalize their longstanding characters with fresh eyes, right? So you had people like Moore, Neil Gaiman, who's kind of canceled now, but he's credited with the Sandman comic book, which is still incredible. You have people like Grant Morrison, who revitalized Batman, and so on and so forth, right? So it's very much part of a generation of creators that wanted to do something new and exciting that the stultified American landscape had kind of stopped doing. Okay. And this is specifically where Moore came in with Swamp Thing. Swamp Thing is a character that Moore did not create, right? Unlike the other two examples that I gave of Watchmen and V for Vendetta, where he was using completely new characters, right? Swamp Thing is a pre-established character. It's been around since the 60s, okay? And was created by, oh shoot, Len Wein, and I forget the name of the artist who created him. But yeah, it doesn't matter. And in the 80s, Moore comes in and is like, there's this character, this weird plant monster, okay, that has an established origin, an established background, and all kinds of stories that he goes on. And the original Swamp Thing, as he was known in the 60s and 70s, was very much in line with what we would see as like the Universal monster movies, right? If any of you have ever seen those like classic movies from the 30s and 40s, right? Your Frankensteins, your Creatures from the Black Lagoons, the Invisible Man, that kind of stuff, right? Campy, schlocky horror. That's what the Swamp Thing was originally like. Okay? I made a joke earlier of saying Frankenstein in the swamp. It's not too far off from what he originally was as a character, right? Moore comes in and completely changes that, right? Makes it much more interesting, I think, than just a guy who was transformed into a plant monster. Okay? And I'm using that version of the origin very deliberately here because, as you would all know from reading this, he kind of plays with that, right? In the 60s and 70s, it was assumed that scientist Alec Holland had blown up in the Louisiana swamp and transformed into Swamp Thing. Very early on in his run, Moore's like, no, let's make it even worse than that. And we can talk about that a little bit later, like that major change that he makes that I'm just giving you context for. Okay. Yeah, does that make sense for everyone? Again, I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but any questions or any like further comments that we wanted to add before getting into Swamp Thing? Brilliant. Okay. To give my voice a rest and to allow me to drink a little bit of water, who would like to tell me what happens in this book? Because a lot happens, but also very little actually happens. like, yeah, I guess we can put it that way. Who wants to like start off? You don't have to say everything. You can just give like a little piece of the puzzle here and there. But from beginning to end, what are some of the major plot points of the Saga of the Swamp Thing, Volume 1?
Patrick, is it correct to say that in this book here, in this Alan Moore book, there is the idea of thingification that we have in the text there? Actually, the attribution of life to a plant that happens to be a man, and that's the thing.
Or that thinks it's a man, right? Because it kind of, right from the start, ish from the start, you get that sense, right? You get the scene in the anatomy lesson chapter where they experiment on Swamp Thing and they're like, oh no, he's not actually a man. There's no like human DNA in this whatsoever, right? And so what they realize is that instead of being a man that was transformed into a swamp creature, it's the swamp that adopted consciousness based off of this person, right? This other scientist, Alec Holland, that was working in the Louisiana swamp. Yes, so absolutely, I think that's fair of like the thingification thing. So good, that's one thing that happens. We learn a little bit more about Swamp Thing's background, where he comes from, what he is. Good. What else happens in this text? Again, just like basic plot points here. We'll get into the analysis.
He has enemies
Sure.
in a specific sense. I mean, I don't know who Arkin is, but I have a feeling he was a kind of enemy in the other books.
Yeah. Okay. So as you probably noticed, I don't know the versions that you used, but Moore comes in the middle of the series, right? The series Moore picks up on Swamp Thing number 20, right? So that month's issue. And he literally calls it loose ends because he's tying up the loose ends from the last chapter, right? So Arcane is a kind of classic Swamp Thing villain. Doesn't really show up in this much, right? Except tangentially, so you don't need to worry about him. But yeah, there are enemies, right? It is a comic book after all, so you do have to play with some of the tropes, right? Superhero, supervillain type of thing. Okay.
But
Yes, Marcio.
Swamp Thing is supposed to be a hero here or a villain?
Maybe that's something we can unpack. Because technically, the villain would be the Floronic Man, right? He is in like our expectations of how narrative works, the kind of antagonist to the title character, right? You'd expect the title character of your book to be the protagonist, generally speaking, right? Harry Potter would be a very different story if Harry Potter wanted to actually kill everyone, right? So you have those certain expectations. But you're right, he doesn't act a lot like a protagonist in many ways in this book. And even the Floronic Man is a classic antagonist in the sense that you're not entirely against some of the stuff that he says, right? Like the basic impulse is onto something, and then there's something that goes a little bit awry, right? And maybe the methods that Floronic Man uses is something that we're less in favor of, which makes it a little bit more antagonistic, right? But you're right in that impulse of saying, is he a villain? Is he a hero? I don't know. I certainly would have put him in the same category as like Superman, for example, who's undoubtedly like always the goody two shoes type of superhero, right? But stay with that impulse. Good. What else happens? These are all great questions. I'm actually writing these questions down so that we can like keep them up.
I notice some kind of eagerness, some kind of greed to obtain answers to, for example, that when they were actually studying the Swamp
Mm-hmm.
Thing there to get the idea of the Swamp Thing what really is, in order to do what with that, to actually to domain the world or to be even more powerful.
Yeah, good. So, tangentially, by asking that question, you kind of picked up on the main plot point, right? I guess of the series. So he starts off. Swamp Thing is walking through the Louisiana forest, Louisiana swamp. Sorry, picking up on the loose ends of the last series, right, where his main villain Arcane kind of died ish. In true comic book fashion, no one ever really dies. They always come back because it's campy and fun, so it doesn't matter. Swamp Thing at the end of chapter one gets shot and captured. Okay. And you're right, Marcio studied. For what purpose is just nebulous enough to keep us interested, right? I'm trying to turn to the page here where they are trying to explain it. Um, if I remember correctly, just going off of memory, so I don't have to spend too much time looking through the book, the reason why they're looking for or studying Swamp Thing is mainly for his regenerative capacities, right? Like they notice that this plant creature is able to reconstruct itself and to expand itself. And again, they're still operating at the start under the assumption that it's a man turned into a plant. Okay. So they're saying, what if we can apply this or turn this into something that can be pharmaceuticalized, for example, or capitalized upon, right? This kind of healing or regenerative type of thing. Okay. Mentions it at the very beginning. The kind of old guy, the old scientist guy who backs up, who financially backs up the entire project, kind of mentions it that his wife has had problems, and it's something that kind of encourages him to look into Swamp Thing and his capacity to kind of regrow, which I think is something really interesting. It's not something I had intended to talk about in this class, but I'm thinking about it now, so might as well just say it. Um, there's kind of interesting commentary here, and I don't know to what extent Moore was intentionally thinking of this, but it's certainly relevant to today, of how we tend to capitalize in the contemporary world, especially the contemporary medical world, on quote unquote natural remedies, right? And turning natural remedies into these easy to consume and easy to do pills, for example. Okay. And that's kind of what that makes me think of, that specific moment of harvesting nature, or what we think is nature's capacity to heal our body, the planet itself, right? And turn it into pure science, pure medical, pure scientific medical stuff, medicine. That completely misses the point of why these natural remedies may be interesting to people in the first place.
And
Right?
this should be a way of breaking the pharmacy industry as well.
Look, I'm not someone who's like as active in like the whole pharmaceutical debate, right? I'm someone who's lucky enough to be healthy in my life that I've never had to like deal with this in my life. What I'm saying as a point here is I've heard a lot of people say similar things. So if it is a way of breaking pharmaceutical control, for them, right? of like actually using natural remedies. I can't speak enough to it, but I can imagine that people would actually gravitate towards it, right? Which, by the way, can go into some really like weird directions, both positive and negative. Positive because yeah, there is a long history of humanity using what the earth has to offer in order to heal themselves, right? Like something as simple as healthy eating, right? Or what's the term? I only have biological in mind, but that's not the term.
Organic.
Organic. Thank you. Yes, organic eating, right? Like people who kind of co-opt or use the rhetoric of organic eating as a kind of health substitute. Um, but on the other hand, it also works in really nefarious ways, where that's one of the reasons why people, for example, um, reject things like vaccines, right? Because it's scientific and unnatural, quote unquote, right? Um, I'm not going to stand here and say don't get vaccines. I absolutely think you should get vaccinated. That's not the point I'm trying to make, all right? But you can kind of see how it can go both ways in perhaps nefarious or positive ways. So that's a whole discussion for another time. But I think the comic book is intelligent enough that it opens up that possibility for that discussion, right? That some people try to co-opt what seems to be nature's gifts, right, of healing into some kind of scientific and technocratic way, right? Um, I don't know if that answers your question, Marcy. Yeah, cool. Um, yeah, so just to come back to the plot, so he gets captured, studied, because it's a comic book and things have to happen, right? It's a narrative. He escapes, of course, back to the swamp after killing his captor. Okay, because as Marcio rightfully pointed out, why not make it a little bit dark and grim, right? You wouldn't imagine Superman killing his captors, right? You can't imagine Superman killing Lex Luthor, right? Laser beaming through the chest or whatever. But you can imagine Swamp Thing just kind of killing someone with a root system. That works, right? And justified. That's fine. I don't care. Um, but then what happens? This is where it gets really interesting. Is after he escapes from the science lab thingy, the antagonist kind of shifts. It's no longer Tremaine, it becomes Woodrue and himself, arguably. Right? And when I say himself, I mean Swamp Thing itself. I don't know if you can gender a plant monster. Doesn't matter, right? So, what exactly happens in like the second half of the story after he escapes, so to speak? And I haven't forgotten all the questions. We'll get to them.
There's this blend there, and it seems that Woodrow is not a good person, or and it feels like the Swamp Thing. Okay, he is the hero, and something is gonna change in his actually roots,
Mm-hmm.
because the Woodrow, since he was in jail, he was not a good person, and according to what it's written here,
Yeah.
it seems it's gonna change the Swamp Thing character
Mm-hmm.
because of the that blend there, I
Good.
believe.
Okay. Um, so Woodrow, I guess if you want to qualify him as any kind of villain, he's an eco-terrorist, if you kind of want to say it that way, right? Yes, he has the shape of a man, but he's basically like, yeah, humanity sucks. That's his basic premise: is humanity sucks. How about we turn the entire planet into a tree or a tree system? That would be sick, right? Um, and he uses Swamp Thing to get to that, right? Because what he realizes is that Swamp Thing seems to have some kind of connection to the planet, right? Um, Later comics would explicitly call this the Green, right? Which is like the comic book term for the Earth's life force, if you want to call it that, right? And he taps into that and basically starts to wreak the havoc that he does for most of the rest of the book, right? Kind of slowly turning the planet and Earth into kind of like jungle-like thing, while Swamp Thing has an existential crisis, and dreams of whether or not he's actually a human. Okay, good. I think that pretty much covers it. I don't know if any of you read the like last two chapters. I told you you could stop. It's fine. But okay, that's fine. Okay, good. Last two chapters we get into like the arrival of demons and stuff. It doesn't matter. It's still a fun thing, but it's like it's the start of a new story, so we're just kind of ignoring it.
You said
Also,
demon?
yeah, in the last two chapters of the collection I have, at least the way they collected it, there's a character called Etrigan the Demon that shows up. This kind of yellow-looking guy.
Oh, that's a hell of a demon.
It's so cool. And he speaks in like poetic language all the time. It's fun.
Just
um,
like the main character for Vendetta. There, he speaks point all the
yeah.
time there.
Yeah. Moore did not create Etrigan. Etrigan's another like long-standing character in the comic books, so maybe he was just thinking of that. I don't know. Um, okay, so the first thing that you mentioned, Marcio, and I think that's a good place to start, is the idea of thingification, right? Of Swamp Thing. So, do you want to expand on that? Like, what do you mean by thingification here? Why? What made you use that term? How does it fit in with the book itself?
Shall we say that thingification is the way that we actually get close to the to matter, and how we attribute meaning to the real matter, what matters?
Mm-hmm. So, does matter matter?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it does. Good. Um, we, I think that's really good, right? And the term here, attributes, is an interesting one because attributes means giving, right? Or ascribing, of course. The more interesting question, perhaps, aside from just the thingification, which is like chucked throughout this book, right? What is a thing, right? Who actually gives the attribute, right? Who attributes, I guess, or who provides attributions of terms, right? Is, I think, something that more, again, whether consciously or unconsciously, I don't know, is thinking about. What I mean by this is when the series starts, when this book starts, you may not have had this perception because you weren't necessarily aware of something, but readers at the time would have expected that as readers, they attributed a certain character trait to Swamp Thing. He's a man who transformed, right? Man who becomes thing, right? More changes that, okay? And suddenly in the text, we have scientist attributing thing humanness, I guess, or humanness to a thing, if you want to pull it, qualify it as that. And then the rest of the book flips that, right? After he escapes, it becomes Thing, Swamp Thing, thinking through his own thingness. I guess you can kind of put it that way, right? I'm using thing way more than I expected to in a single sentence here, but the point here is it matters on the level of who attributes the qualities to something, right? Um, why does this matter? I'll launch that question to you. Why does it matter who attributes what qualities to a thing? Or does it matter? Perhaps is also a question that we can ask. And this gets back to Barad, by the way, and her criticism of language. Does it matter, and why does it matter, if at all, who attributes a quality to something or someone?
Uh, I believe so,
Okay. Yes.
because
Good.
let's just say we have the idea of pioneer there, the guy that actually discovers something, and that something is gonna carry his name, her name, for the rest of its existence. And I would say it matters who actually attributes value to a thing.
Good. I like
I
that
think
use
so.
of value here.
Oh, value is good.
Well, of course.
Actually, I was lack of word here, and let's just try to improvise.
No. Why does value matter? Like the qualities that we give something are extremely valuable, right? And again, look, the reason why I said that this comes back to Barad, and then Leonie, I saw that you were unmuted, so I'll let you speak in a sec, is because for her, the representationalism that she's criticizing has become the peak form of value, right? So yes, good. Value matters, right? Where we find that value and how we attribute that value is extremely important. And it does come back to attribution, right? And who attributes it. Go ahead, Ian.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
listening. I'm just looking up something, but I'm listening.
no, it's all good. It's normally like humans that attribute value or meaning like to other beings. So I don't know if it does like because it's done within language. I don't think it necessarily happens the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Um, not sure where I'm going with that. Yeah.
Sometimes you don't know where, like,
Yeah.
thoughts just kind of lead us to believe. So good. So absolutely. We often have a tendency to consider that humans are the ones who attribute meaning to the world. Yeah. And if anything, right, you may like or dislike this book. We can talk about our critical engagement with it a little bit later. But if anything, it is a book that kind of subverts that hierarchy. It is a very non anthropocentric book in many ways. Okay. And it does so by specifically destabilizing who attributes what, right? Or what attributes what, I guess. If again you want to play around with prepositions. But humans that do actually do any kind of attribution, whether it's us as readers or the scientists in the text, right, are thoroughly proven wrong by the titular thing, right? That does not have any kind of human qualities aside from its vague shape, I guess, that looks kind of human, right? And even then, it's only in the faintest sense, right? The outline of it is human. Um, I, Everything else is subject to debate, right? So good, excellent. These are wonderful points. Alicia, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to add to that, but very, very good points from both of you. Thank you for that. Alicia, do you have anything you wanted to add, or the attribution part?
Not really, no, I've been writing a lot notes.
Okay. It's one of those classes today where we're writing down a
Mhm.
lot of things. Good, good, good. Um, I'm looking for, uh, let's see
Does
if I
it
can.
like is it kind of a way to like challenge or to imagine how something else than like human beings attributing meaning to
Say
the
that again.
world or
You cut out for a sec on
oh
my
okay
end. Yeah.
um is like the way the swamp and the creature is in control of the narrative and how um it is itself like its identity and how it's perceived.
Yeah.
Is that like challenging the more um the way we tend to believe that humans are the only ones able to attribute meaning.
I would say so. I
That
would
was
say
hard
yes.
to
No,
put
no,
in a sentence.
I would say yes, and that works on um, more than one level, I guess, for me. So one in the level of plot and themes that are expounded on in the text, absolutely. I would say even on the level of the form, right? As a comic book. Why would I say that? How is the level of form kind of destabilizing this? Does anyone have any indication as to why that might be the case? And I'm looking for a specific page. There's many pages that are good examples of this.
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Okay, so whenever we read a text, whether it's poetry, novels, short stories, or comic books, there is a form to it, certain
Yep,
expectations and standards that we would have as to what these texts look like.
yep,
Yeah. I would argue that this comic book plays with the form or plays with our expectations of what a comic book is
okay.
and looks like. That also ties in with the destabilizing that you're talking about.
Is it
I'm
like at the
asking,
level of how the character um like just doesn't do much for the whole thing? Like, is
okay,
that what you mean, or is it more in the
oh, that's not what I was thinking of, but that I think that could work. Yeah.
okay,
It's kind of passive in many
yeah,
ways, right? Swamp Thing spends most of his time just contemplating,
yeah,
but also is the central character. So it's kind of blurs the line between active and passive in a way that
yeah,
I think again ties into Barad, right?
yeah, yeah,
Where things that we perceive as completely passive, again, I'll use the easy example of a tree on the side of a road, that have a great deal of impact, just the way that art works. And so
yeah.
I think that's absolutely that. Um, I'm trying to find a really good example of this. It mostly happens, I would say, at the beginning of the story, but not exclusively. Um, what else might be a good way in which the form is played? Uh, when we think of a comic book, I'll ask the question this way. And you're looking at the page, what do you expect to see on the page, right? How do you expect it to be constructed, right? On the most like fundamental basic levels.
Squares, drawings,
Okay,
bubbles, with writing in them.
good. Marcio, is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, something related to that. I would expect something like more, let's just say traditional, square by square, something like
Good.
that.
Yeah,
And if you take a look, for example, at the page 96 there, you're gonna see a completely a display, a completely different display from the usual.
this one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you see, you have a triangle there. You have some geometric forms there. In the middle, you have some face there. Uh, I think it's completely different from the usual. I don't know if I'm correct on that.
Yes, good. That's kind of where I was thinking as well. Yes, awesome. So just take, oh, use,
Also, I don't know if I'm the only one, but I don't read a lot of comic books, and
yeah,
like at first I had a hard time figuring out like which way I was supposed to go.
good,
Yeah, no, me too.
And
I
I
was
feel
like,
good.
like
oh,
it might be more obvious in a more regular.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
in this kind of
yeah.
comic book form, you have no problem reading it whatsoever, right? We, in the Western world, just kind of read from left to right, and it's not a problem. Um, yeah, left to right. And yeah, I think this whole book plays with not only what is contained within, as you call them, the squares. Formally, by the way, we call them panels. When we talk about comic book criticism, we say panels. And yeah, so not only are the panels sometimes just not there, right? But also at various points, and this is what I was looking for, and I, I think I looked too quickly and couldn't find it. The vegetation and Swamp Thing, or even the Floronic Man, kind of explode deliberately out of the panels themselves, right? So there's technically something that you can perceive as a panel, right? But then there's like a root system that kind of goes out of it, right? Or um, or a tree branch that is not quite fitting in appropriately with what you would expect. Yeah, this is as good of an example as you can get as any, right? Where in this case, the root system is kind of extending out from what you'd expect to be a normal panel, right? Or even at the start, yeah, this is a good example, right? Where the character of Swamp Thing itself is the framing device, right? Of the rest of the page, right? Which kind of, even though it takes up the majority of the page as you would see it, it's not really what your attention is focused. Your attention is more focused on the kind of marginalia that seems to be lumbering over the rest of the characters. Okay. Yes, absolutely. This is really good. I had written other notes about that. Yeah. So that kind of gets us to something that I find really interesting about examining pieces of literature along the lines of new materialists like Barad, right? Because, as we would expect as literature students, we are dealing with words and art. We're dealing with representation, right? On a fundamental level, no matter how much we want to go against that, or how much like ideologically we can understand that the supremacy of the written word or a spoken word can be problematic, perhaps, right? It is kind of hard to avoid just by our profession or our interests. Okay? I guess as a follow-up question to this question of form, is this a representational text? And this might be a bit of a harder question to answer, so it's fine if you want to take a minute to think about it. Is this a representational text? If so, how? If not, how? Of course, I want you to expand a little bit on it. Well, I'm still looking for the quote that I was looking for earlier.
I want to say, not sure.
Good.
And when,
That is always a correct answer. In the
yeah,
postmodern world that we live in, not sure or a bit of both is always a correct answer. Yeah. Mhm.
'cause I feel like it does challenge, like with the Swamp Thing not being human at all, and just existing and controlling a little bit the narrative without doing much or without seeming to be doing much.
Mhm.
But also you have characters like the Floronic Man, who is kind of like a very good example of representationalism in a sense, because he wants to connect with the land and be the land, and but he like kind of fails at the end because
Mhm.
he is in fact just human.
Good. That's really good. So let's unpack that a little bit. There's like 2 points that you brought up. First, Swamp Thing and Floronic Man, right? And then we can maybe add a third point on the text itself, right? Swamp Thing starts off as believing himself to be very representational, right? He is a man representing the swamp, right? A stand-in for the swamp. And that's flipped on its head, right? He becomes the very matter that he sought to represent. Okay. And again, we can come back to that, but I think even though it's not necessarily obvious, the last chapter that I asked you to read, The Sleep of Reason, has a title that I think indicates a lot of what this move is meant to indicate. Right? Reason with a capital R is always interesting to unpack whenever you see it in a text. The opposite, right, is Floronic Man, who also begins as representational, right, in 2 ways. First, he's true form is that of like this weird plant creature, and he like has this weird sci-fi skin that he puts onto himself, of course, because comic books. And so there's that representation. He represents himself as human, okay, but then tries to then represent himself as of the land. You're absolutely correct. Okay. It fails because he doesn't understand. I guess it kind of comes to heads with Swamp Thing, and part of his downfall as a villain is because he uses it as a method of conquest rather than a method, to come back to our last class, of kin making, perhaps, if you want to use those terms. Okay. So that's very good. On the level of text, and this is something that we can maybe unpack a little bit in after our second break, but on the level of text, we are we're even more getting into the realm of I don't know what to make of this, right? Because we're dealing with a comic book. Why is it more representational, perhaps, than other forms of literature? What is the major difference between a comic book and, say, a novel?
I would say the graphic representation
The
stands
images.
for it. Yeah, the images.
Yes.
Actually, it has a strong appeal on us because just like one image actually can mean more than 1,000 words.
Good. Right. So, but again, you can kind of see how this can maybe operate in a slippery way, right? If you're firmly representing nature as this swamp creature, that triggers something into our mind, right? Certain expectations. You see this like gnarly monster and you think evil, perhaps, right? Or um, unsettling. And it kind of again plays with this, with the representational aspect that you're bringing up, Marcio, of allowing for those possibilities by the very nature of the image. Good. Sorry, you look like you were going to say something else.
No, actually, if the Swamp Thing represents nature, and actually it has that monstrous image there, that we should be aware that nature represents some kind of danger if it's we deal with it in the wrong way. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting crazy here. As I as I usual do here every time I attend this class here, and I like that.
Okay, good. I was going to ask if like it's a. Please don't give me a negative review because of it. No, no, but I think you're right, and that gets back to the differences between Swamp Thing and Floronic Man. Right? They're both kind of nature creatures, but the way that they engage with the world around them, or the way they utilize the world around them, is very different. Right? I think that's 100% correct. And let's see. One of the ways that this plays out in the text is when Floronic Man is actually wreaking havoc, right? The images are almost incomprehensible, right, to our eyes. You can kind of get at what's happening by extension of us being people with imaginations, but it's also like what is actually happening in the background here.
What page is that?
This is 114, right? Like there's all kinds of stuff going on, right, and exploding out from the page. And the way I see it is that it's burning, right, and fire, but it's also deliberately unclear enough that you can kind of maybe fill in a lot of those gaps, right? There's another page that I'll try to find. The one where like Swamp Thing just kind of connects in with the universe or whatever the hell. And it just is completely impossible to kind of make out. Maybe I'm thinking of something
The
else.
way he is in this page 114 here.
Yeah.
I actually remembered Paradise Lost because he has something. Now I'm just another thing here. The way he is that thing here.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Say more.
No,
I
no,
think you're
no,
right.
no, because changes and no, getting that's too much for all of you.
It's absolutely not too much. I've said this before in classes, whether it's in this one or in other classes I've given. You can almost never go wrong with connecting one piece of literature to something, some other piece of literature that it makes you think of.
You shouldn't have said so.
I'm sorry. I just ruined perhaps the rest of this class for
Because
you.
after that, I'm gonna try to make connections every piece of literature possible here.
Look, my partner's staring at me from like behind the computer, so she might like because she's heard me tell this story before. When we live in a world where King Lear can be connected to Metallica's album Ride the Lightning, anything is possible.
No shit. Really?
Yes, really. So, so here's the like transitive properties of King Lear to Ride the Lightning. So in King Lear, the character of Edmund sings a song. Okay,
I love
that
Edmond,
ends.
by the way.
I'm sorry.
I love Edmond, by the way.
Yes, fantastic. And he sings a song called Child Roland, right? If you haven't read King Lear, you should. It's fantastic. But in it, um, we never really get the end, or we don't actually know where that story comes from. It seems to have been a popular story at the time, but it's kind of been lost to history. So, about 200 years after King Lear comes out, famous poet Robert Browning decided to set himself a challenge where he wrote one poem a day, okay, for a year. Robert Browning had the capacity to do it. I don't recommend that you do it for the sake of your sanity. So he was inspired by that song that Edmund sings in King Lear. Okay? And he wrote an excellent poem called Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came. Okay? And it's a beautiful poem about a knight who is on a quest for a dark tower. Now, does the Dark Tower ring any bells for you? As
Uh, since you are making a connection with Metallica, I remember that song, "The Enter Sandman."
oh, okay, so it's before Enter Sandman comes out, but
Yeah,
um,
there is a song. Yeah.
there is Enter Sandman, but Ride the Lightning comes out before Enter Sandman, so it's not relevant to this particular thing. So Dark Tower, or that poem, Childe Roland to the Dark Tower Came, inspires none other than Stephen King to write his book series, The Dark Tower. Okay. So he takes this Robert Browning poem and writes basically like a 14-book series in it. And in it, one of the characters who's about to get electrocuted says, I'm about to ride the lightning. And that line inspired Kirk Hammett when he wrote Ride the Lightning. So you can absolutely like connect all of that. The only reason that Ride the Lightning exists is King Lear.
Amazing.
I feel like a conspiracy theorist with like little lines all over the place. I'm making obviously this is an exaggerated version. But
Remember, you might be creating monsters here, right?
okay, so we're going to talk about this after the break, but the Paradise Lost thing might actually not be that far fetched. In part because Swamp Thing is very much a romantic and very much a Frankenstein like character. Okay. And I mean Frankenstein not in the sense of like him being created out of dead refuse, but as a creature searching for meaning in the world, right? It's actually not that far off because what does Frankenstein read? Like Frankenstein's creature, what does it read in the actual novel? It reads Paradise Lost in order to get a sense of its humanity, right?
Yeah.
So, no, I don't think it's entirely out of the realm of possibilities that at least somewhere in the background of Moore's mind as he was writing this, or maybe in Stephen Bissett's mind as he was drawing this, that there was some kind of element of fallen man there, as Milton would have established it. So no, I don't think I made a joke a little bit about it, but I don't think it's necessarily a far-fetched connection to make at all. Yeah. Um, okay. Anything else that we want to add before we gotta go on to other tangents of tangents? So when we come back, take another like 5 minute break or so. When we come back, we can unpack this a little bit, especially the relation to romanticism and therefore reason, which I think is a really interesting thing to unpack of the text. And then we might, by extension, depending on how much time we have, come back to that question that we asked at the beginning of whether or not we can consider this heroic narrative, right? Because I think it's a very valid question to ask. Okay. Good work, everyone. Take a break, and yeah, that's it. Sorry, we'll just give Marcio a minute and then start back up again.
Back.
You're back. So, oh, now Leonie's gone. There we go. Um, so, I guess quick tangent. Has anyone actually seen the new Frankenstein movie?
I did.
Yeah. Okay.
Not
It's
yet.
on my list.
It's on your list.
Yes.
What did you think of it, Marcio?
Uh, it's more human than ever,
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
in
I
comparison
would
to
say
the
so.
other versions.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that a good thing for you?
I believe so
Okay.
because he is more than his own creator, and I don't know if you guys are okay
If
with
you've
this
read
point.
Frankenstein, it's this. It's
Yeah,
basically the
something
same
like
idea.
that. Because at the end, I always wanted to say that sentence. I don't know if you're okay, whatever. So at the end, it's a kind of more emotional than the other versions,
Yeah.
and in this movie here, we can see how vulnerable the
Hmm.
creature is, and
Yeah.
always comparing to the previous versions there, and I really like it.
Yeah. It's pretty good. They made some changes to it, and I'm not sure why they did it. Aside from just creating unnecessary conflict that was already present in the book, they changed that, and they changed like I feel the thematic core, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just not what I was expecting, right? Because the this new version is more about forgiveness, right? That's kind of like that finale is more of emphasized on that rather than I guess seeking out human consciousness in any way or like achieving any kind of realization of what it means to be human. But yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I would give it a good 7 out of 10.
How good is seven? Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
good.
The Victor Frankenstein part is not that compelling to me. Like once the creature actually shows up and starts to explain its tale, that's where it kind of really hits its stride for me. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I only bring it up because we were talking about it before the break, and I was just curious if anyone had actually, yeah, had actually read it or seen it. But yeah, the design is pretty good. I still can't. I know it's not accurate to the book. I still love the original like 1930s Universal monster one with the freaking bolts in its neck.
You like that plot?
I love it. It's so stupid.
What is that thing for?
I think it's for the electrical current.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's like jacked in to
Mhm.
that. But also just because it looks cool. I'm sure like that's the beginning. And knowing what I know about movie production in the 1930s, they mostly thought of it like this would be a cool visual. And indeed it is. It's iconic. So that's it. That's the beginning, middle, and end of my TED talk on why the 1930s version is cool. Is it silly and hokey? Yes, but I like silly and hokey things sometimes, so I give it a pass. Okay, but there is a kind of obvious comparison, of course, as we've been continuously mentioning between Swamp Thing and the novelized version of Frankenstein. Right, this thing that kind of is created despite its will. Okay, and that once it does have some kind of free will, doesn't know necessarily what to do with it or how to engage with it in a way that is perhaps healthy or appropriate to any kind of circumstances, right? To the world that it's in. Right? Obviously, that's a through line in Frankenstein, and it's a through line in Paradise Lost. It's a through line in Swamp Thing. Right? It's almost as if a lot of Western media is interested in the concept of free will. Who knew, right? And I'm thinking of a way of actually asking this question. So we discussed at the beginning of class how whether it's good or not is up to debate, but we are still very much in the shadow of Romanticism, right? Both on a literary level, it's very difficult for a lot of writers to kind of extirpate themselves from that shadow, but also on a like philosophical level, and in the way that we engage with the world around us, we're still very much beholden to Romanticism as a broad movement. And I think in many ways, despite being heavily indebted to it, it's also something that this is also a text, Swamp Thing, that rejects some aspects of Romanticism, okay, while embracing some others. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this. And again, this is kind of a big and loaded question that we can take in a lot of directions, so we don't have to necessarily answer it all in one go or all immediately. But I think it is interesting to consider how texts such as this one are attempting to break out of this romantic mode that has haunted us for 300 years at this point, almost. Okay. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on that. I can get us started if we want, but before that, I'm curious. Yeah.
Uh, you mentioned there there is a break with the romanticism there. Actually, the presence of the technology there,
Mm-hmm.
actually creating things,
Good.
and how realistic they tend to be, and
Mm-hmm.
how cruel as well, and actually put the idea of romanticism aside.
Yeah.
And
Good.
that's and this is how I see this piece of literature there.
Good. Yeah. I wasn't thinking of that, but that's actually really good. As we've talked about, right, Romanticism had a tendency to reject a lot of industrial modernity, right, or to want to move away from it, and go back to a time, even if it's only in the imagination, when factories and um, technological pollution and so on was not as ever present in the world around us, right? Whereas this, you're absolutely right, right? It is a firmly contemporary book in many ways. It undoubtedly takes place in the 80s, full of oversized suits, shady businessmen, and technology that can only exist in a 1980s comic book, right? Very good. So there is a bit of that going on. And maybe if you wanted to write an essay about this, you can maybe tie this back to the idea of transhumanism that we talked about briefly last week, right? Of how pieces of technology like this allow humans to still remain human, but expand certain capacities that we have. So good. I think that's a really good way of seeing the romantic being a bit subverted, right? Any other ways that we were thinking of?
I thought about how nature is usually portrayed in romanticism eras as, pure,
Mm-hmm.
beautiful, just kind of united in a way, and something is more dangerous. It doesn't seem as beautiful, or is not described as any kind of a magical place. It's well, magical in the sense of like, oh
Yeah.
my God, this is beautiful and amazing. It's more like it's
Yeah.
it's way darker than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is an acknowledgement that going into the swamp at night might kill you, actually, right? It's not this place of untouched beauty.
Yeah.
Good. What's the term that the Romantics used for this perception of nature? They had a very specific term for it.
The sublime.
Good. Absolutely. Um, is this a book that engages with nature as sublime? No. I would say a categorical no. Right? There is no sublimity whatsoever in this. Um, maybe in one part at the end, right, in the Sleep of Reason, can maybe be considered an engagement with the sublime, if very briefly. But by and large, no. Right? It is a firmly non-subliminal, sublimated, subliminal. No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be neither. I don't know what the adjective for sublime would be. I guess it would just be sublime, non-sublime thing. Okay. Um, what else? There's still one more thing in which it's kind of anti-romantic. Actually, no. Ooh, well, maybe it may be romantic or not, depending on your view of it.
Um, well, I was gonna say the Swamp Thing, the character itself, is kind of non-romantic in a way.
Mm-hmm. Good. Say more.
Um, well, it's because it's passing between two things. He's like thinking about what he is and where he comes from, but like it's not central exactly because the self is like he's non-human, he's a plant, but he's also feeling emotions about it. So
Mm-hmm.
kind of it's kind of a mix where I would say it's not exactly romantic, but it could also be in a way romantic because of all the thinking he's going through about it. So I'm like,
Okay. So one of the things that we mentioned before, and I think you're right, Alicia, by the way. One of the things that we mentioned before the break is the way in which this story engages, even if it's mostly in the background, with capital R reason. Two questions. One, when we say capital R reason, what do we mean? Two, how did the Romantics feel about this concept? This is something that I don't think we talked about explicitly, so it's okay if you don't know it, but I'm curious if like, because I think it does segue into this book. So what is reason when we talk about it? How did the Romantics feel about it? And you can tie this back into Frankenstein, by the way. There's an explicit correlation here. Okay, so I'll start by defining reason in the most like basic basic way that I possibly can. The way that it's often used in the humanities is to describe, actually similar way to Barad here, um, to describe the way that post Descartes, right? I think, therefore I am, right? A lot of Western philosophy has focused on the supremacy of the mind, right, for rational thought, and that a lot of the problems in our world can be solved with logic and rationality, right? Obviously, there are hundreds of books that have been written on this, so we're not going to get into this, but usually that's the kind of Cliff Notes version of how we would understand reason. The rationalization of the world. There's a problem, it can be solved with math, science, and not so abstract philosophy. Right? That's why Descartes and his dictum is so central. Right? It's the complete antithesis of abstract philosophy. I think equals I am. Boom. Math, great, wonderful. Right? Um, Now, I'll let you answer the question. How did the Romantics feel about this? Good, bad, ambivalent?
Incapable.
Ooh, that's good. I like that. Not what I was expecting, but I'm not against it. Good, 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 good. Wait, explain what you mean.
Um, because I don't know about you guys, Leonie, Alicia, when it comes to numbers, calculations, and things like that, and it's something that kind of intimidate us people from humanities.
Mm-hmm.
And every time we have to do with that, we are kind of, oh my, okay, I better get back to my books instead of trying to deal with this. And I would say that incapable because we tend to find the answer to this these questions there in theories connected with humanities, because we people from letters are not supposed to deal with math theories and physics theories and things like that. I don't know if you guys have the very same feeling towards maths and physics and things like that.
They can all die. That's fine. Yeah. I'm joking. I say that only because I failed my maths real hard.
Oh, welcome to the club.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I think that's a good point, right? The idea of impossibility, and there's something utterly irrational about the primacy of rationality, right? Um, and that's, I think, very much in keeping with the Romantics. The Romantics, in many ways, were 100% products of the age of reason, right? As people who really wanted to emphasize the capacities of the mind to understand the world, right? But also reject the scientization. Yeah, I guess you could say the scientization of said world, right? And getting at some kind of phenomenological embrace of it, which is to them very irrational or not necessarily rational. Good. Very good. This is, I think, really well expressed. I'm looking at page 66 of Swamp Thing here, early on in the text, if you have it with you. I'm using an older version of the text, so I don't know if the page numbers are the same necessarily. But yeah, it's this one, right? Okay, so good. It's the same pages. Awesome. So the okay. There's a really interesting passage at the top of that page in the first three panels where Jason Woodrue is seeing Swamp Thing, and he says something very interesting about him. It ties in, I think, with what we're talking about here. Sorry, we just received a package also, and I had forgotten that I had ordered some books, and so now I just got some books. So that's fantastic, I guess. I don't know if I had. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So yeah, what is that passage that I'm thinking of? In the first three panels at the top.
It should be that moss encrusted. No, it shouldn't be that.
Is it the fact that he's infected with the consciousness?
You were so close, Marcio, with the moss infected, just above it, right? What does that tell us? He was a mass of plant fiber that had somehow been infected with the consciousness of Alec Holland. That's a really strong choice of words there, infected.
Yeah, the the fact that he now has like he holds within itself the mind of a
Mm-hmm.
human is considered an infection. So
What
it's
else
like
is
a
implied
bad
with it?
thing.
So it's a bad thing. Usually, when we're
Yeah,
infected with something, we're not
yeah,
like,
yeah,
"Yay, good," right? Like, I like having a toe infection or whatever, right? Like, it's not a fantastic
yeah.
thing. Good. So negative. What else is implied with the term infection?
You acquired something.
It's acquired,
Yeah, acquired forcibly.
perhaps attributed,
Yeah,
and also, can you spread an infection?
uh, probably.
Generally, yeah, but depends on the infection, of course. Like, but yeah,
Hmm.
sometimes you can, right? Um, So yeah, absolutely. Like a disease or a virus can be infectious, right?
Hmm.
Um, and again, that tells us a lot, not only about like just this book's relation to reason, but specifically also Woodrew's, right? The Floronic man's perspective on reason. Um, and consciousness. I know consciousness and reason are technically two separate things, but for the sake of this book, they're pretty much interchangeable. And his whole kind of character arc as someone who is very anti-anthropocentric, right, which we talked about in the first part of class, is rooted, haha, pun, rooted, in this choice of humanity and consciousness as infection, right? And I think that's really interesting, but it also implies that like he doesn't consider plants to be infectious or having consciousness in some way, right? Which is perhaps a weird duality that he has, or that he's willing to accept certain other types of consciousness, but not human. It's left kind of nebulous here, but I think it is still getting at getting at this kind of ambiguity towards reason that carries us throughout most of the book. Right. Contrast that to Swamp Thing, especially by the end, right? The last two chapters, including the one that culminates in the Sleep of Reason. What is Swamp Thing's relation to capital R reason? How does he seem to be a reasonable creature, or a creature endowed with rationality in some way? In what way does that transpire in the text? I'm also looking for a specific passage. I would say there's an example of it on page 142, and then a little bit later on 150, 151. 142, especially towards the bottom.
Well, that's a hard one, huh?
It is. It is. No, not saying it's easy. Never is easy.
Oh yeah, of course. I forgot that.
Easy answers are for losers.
That's definitely a nice motto.
I'll have that on a t-shirt. I'll print it out for next class.
Or
Okay, so I'm looking at the page of 142 bottom, and specifically in this case, Annie was talking with Swamp Thing. She leaves. They had a nice conversation, and it sets up the future of this series, basically. And he has this kind of interior monologue or interior narration. After she has gone, he stands and listens to the water, the trees, the insects. Autumn is coming. Autumn and something else, something dark. In the corner of his eye, a sudden blur of gray moving through the treetops. Up to the right, he turns, focusing. It's gone. He stands, he wonders, what comes with the autumn? And then a little bit later we can continue, but generally, do we have a more toxic view of rationality that seems here? Is there anything related to like infection necessarily?
actually, it just stands for some kind of transformation there, and I
Good.
see some a note of romanticism here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if it exists, but it sounds like to me, at
Yeah,
least.
he's there is absolutely a hint of romanticism in, I would say, two ways. And I keep getting a notification, sorry, here that says Zoom quit unexpectedly. And can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I just hope it lasts until the end of the class. um, so there's two things, right? So first of all, just the way the panel composition works, right? Singular, dark figure, right? Very evocative, perhaps, of some of the romantics that we were thinking of. I've showed this in class before. That figure standing in front of an ocean, right, or a mountain. It's a bit unclear in the picture, but and staring out into the vast sublime, right? You kind of get an echo of this in this panel, right? Staring out into the sky, right? Maybe even Paradise Lost, right? Staring out into some version of God. I don't know, right? The Romantics would not have necessarily called it God. They would have just called it nature with a capital N, right? And I think you're right with the transformation in two ways. One, autumn is often seen as a transitionary season, right? Between summer and winter, which at least here in North America we seem to consider like the two main seasons, and spring and fall kind of the in between seasons. What else is autumn associated with, thematically speaking? Literary analysis 101 here. Whenever you see autumn in a text, what immediately should trigger in your mind? And
Well,
it's
since you have this image, this analysis of image here, so this one you showed us, one here, it's kind of the connect with the nature,
good.
romanticism, if
Yep,
you
yep.
will. And after that, you have some kind of chaos here because
Oh, good. Yeah, 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 yeah. Uh-huh. Good. I like that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
is that
unclear.
right?
Yeah, sure. That's not what I was going for, but I think that's good. Yeah,
I
I
want to say
like it.
And
monsters. Am I taking this too far?
With autumn, you mean?
Like darkness and like monsters.
It's even more simple than that.
More simple than that.
Okay, think of another romantic poet. If you've ever read, have you ever read Keats's To Autumn, the Ode to Autumn? Okay, you should. It's phenomenal. But part of the reason why this poem works so well is because it subverts our expectations of autumn. So it's a poem about life and the excesses of gourds and fruits and yellow, vibrant colors. But typically, we don't associate autumn with that. We associate autumn with coming death, generally speaking, right? And again, authors have played with this a lot, but there's a basic sense that we get, right? This kind of looming shadow, it's getting colder, days are getting shorter, right? The shadows and so on. And
what's the, I'm sorry, what's the name of the poem again?
it's just called To Autumn,
To Autumn.
yeah, by Keats. And, you know, this last panel, what does it look like? Right? What does Swamp Thing's head look like in this last panel?
Ah, it's called.
Yeah, right? More than ever, his eyes are kind of hollowed out, right? You don't really see his pupils or anything like that as much as you see them in the rest of the story, I guess. And no particular features that would even make him close to human, right? And so to bring it back to this kind of like romantic rationality that the book has an ambiguous relation with, right? On the one hand, we have Woodrue who's absolutely rejecting it, right? Like plant supremacy 101, let's go, right? Whereas we see in Swamp Thing this kind of dual relationship happening, right? This willingness to embrace some kind of attempt at will and thought and expanding your mind, but still very much connected with the chaos, to use your term, Marcio, that's out there, and the cycles and revisions of that come naturally, right, on the planet, right? Obviously, this is something that is explored further in later texts, right? This is just hinted at in this particular volume, okay, because he has to set up later stories that he's going to be writing about, and we don't have time to necessarily get into the entirety of Alan Moore's run on the character, right? Because it goes on for like 4 or 5 volumes. So we don't necessarily have time here, but we get that hint, right, already. It's a little bit more, romantic here. I would even go so far as to say, to make one final connection to Frankenstein here, the idea of will is a particularly interesting one, right? Frankenstein's creature was deliberately created, right? Victor Frankenstein wanted to make this thing, right? Which is where Shelley's criticism of reason comes in, right? It is the utmost limits of reason to Shelley that someone would be so foolhardy as to defy death, right? That's the point she's making, obviously. There is a kind of subversion of this. Swamp Thing is not created by anyone. He's created by accident, right? Like the planet is maybe the agent that creates this thing, right? Creature, but it's not a result of scientific hubris, so to speak, right? It's the result of the planet being itself and wanting to perhaps extend itself past whatever it conceives itself to be, right? So there is a bit of a flip on that kind of romantic ideal as well, right? Creatures existing not because of scientific hubris, but because of the will of the planet. I don't know if that, maybe that's tenuous. I don't know. That's just the thought that popped into my mind. I don't know if anyone had anything they wanted to say or add. I know we're almost up on time here, but okay. I freaked you all out. Okay. Yeah, we don't necessarily need to get into the rest of this, but you do see hints of this on page 150 and 151, and even before he fights Floronic Man, when Swamp Thing is kind of having his weird fever dreams and imagining himself holding his own skull, you have this fantastic kind of playing um, off of the limits of the imagination, right? And where our imagination takes us, where he's able to conceive of the body that never was, right? In many ways. He never was Alec Holland. He's only the shadow of Alec Holland, right? And yet he's still imaginatively able to construct himself as such in the dream. And I think that's really cool. Which brings me to the quote that I was desperately looking for earlier today and could not find it. Has anyone here ever read The Tempest? No, I know I asked Danny and Adisha in week 1 if they'd ever read The Tempest, and you'd said no. Marcio, have you ever read The Tempest?
No.
Okay. There's a fantastic line in it because, of course, there is. There's a fantastic line in it by Prospero, the kind of wizard character in that weird island, and it's become one of the classic Shakespeare lines. And it goes, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." Use of stuff is incredible here. What is the stuff of dreams? Right? Like, what does it mean to be the stuff as dreams are made on? It's like Shelley's thing in the everlasting universe of things in Mont Blanc, right? It's both tangible and inherently impossible to actually grasp at, right? And I think again, this might be something that Moore was kind of thinking of in the back of his mind, right? When he was having this swamp creature dream of his non-existent self as a way of constructing his real self. Again, maybe it's an overreading. I don't know. But this is where my mind goes. Sometimes I just think of these little connections here and there and see where it takes me. Which, by the way, you can absolutely do in your essays as well. I'll totally accept just like a fever dream of an essay that you just kind of make these connections. Sometimes those are the best essays.
It's okay if I connect Pink Floyd with one of the books we've read here.
You can certainly try. I've never been the greatest fan of Pink Floyd, but I'm sure there's something there.
Okay, all right. But you are a Metallica fan.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Who isn't, right?
I know it doesn't show with like the pink shirts and all of that, but like yeah, I do vibe with Metallica. Yeah, early Metallica certainly, like pre 1995 Metallica. Let's go.
Let's see.
Yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts on Swamp Thing? Did we actually like this story? I wanted to give us a little bit more of a like lighthearted thing after having read 2 weeks of the Tiger Flu, but then we ended up having one of the more like complicated discussions of the class. But did we actually like this, dislike it? What were our like general thoughts on Swamp Thing?
I thought it was fun. It was fun to read something different too.
Yeah.
I've been reading a lot of novels. I was reading 4 other novels this week, so it was fun to look at a graphic novel for once.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to give us like the end of the semester. You'll notice is a little bit more light on the reading, as far as like difficulty is concerned.
Much appreciated.
Marcio and Alicia, good, bad, eh?
Yeah, no, I liked it. I liked reading comic books when I was younger, and I just stopped for a while. I don't know why. I guess I hadn't had time, so I just enjoyed it, and
Yeah.
it took me a while to recognize how to read it, but when I got there, it was fun.
Yep. Good. Marcio?
I also enjoy that because I actually grew up watching superheroes there, and this is kind of stimulating, I would say. Superheroes, and it makes you actually travel a lot, imagine things that don't exist,
Yeah.
and you come out of reality just like we have now. Everything is white, you see?
Oh,
I
well.
wish I could have some kind of superpower and, in order to
Yeah.
avoid all that snow.
The superpower of a flamethrower and just
That would be great.
yeah, but that's a really good example though of like the cycles of nature and the instability of nature, right? Where we tend to imagine obviously the earth is warming, right? That's not necessary aside from a few like major people, the earth is warming for most people. And it's just so out of whack for us that in November, even before all this climate change stuff, it's a bit unusual to have this much snow in November, right? And all of these, this is a perfect example actually of how the cycles of the planet are completely out of our control in many ways, right? And no matter how much we try to get at it through reasonable thought or poetry or comic books, right, there is something a lot grander at play, right? And I think to bring it back to all of the points, not just the comic book, but to the more theoretical points that we were talking about earlier, I think this is a really good example of the kind of interactivity that Barad is talking about, right? Where the reason why it's snowing outside may not make sense to us, right? But there is a whole series of actions before this that kind of made it possible to be in this moment at in this particular frame of mind, right? And I think that's really interesting to consider, right? What those actions were, both human and non-human, that led to this bizarre 15 centimeters of snow in early November, right? That then has an impact on how we exist, right, as creatures in Montreal in 2025, right? And this is not meant to be like a deep philosophical point. It's just a really good example of what exactly Barat is talking about, right? It's never just one specific thing. It's a series of things that coalesce and merge and unmerge in order to create this kind of weird dialectical process of the planet. Good. Thank you for all your thoughts. Those were really awesome. As usual, I'm happy with this class. It's fun.
Thank you for your time, Patrick.
Mhm.
Before you go, next week, two things. We have Alicia's presentation. Yeah, Alicia's presentation is not there to confirm. I'll send her an email because she has basically two options left for her presentation. So so yeah, Alicia's presentation next week. The so slow violence for the theory, right? It's the introduction that I put in, right? So you can kind of focus on that. And the other text is an excerpt as well that I think works on its own. And it might be disconcerting to actually read, but I think that's also part of the form of the text. Right? We talked about being unsure of how to read Swamp Thing. I think part of the appeal of the excerpt that I'm giving you for next week is that it does drop you into the middle of a completely new story in the middle of the novel. Right? So it's meant to be kind of unruly and disconcerting.
Mm.
So has anyone here ever read Don DeLillo's White Noise? Okay. Kind of peak postmodern fiction, right? Also created in the 80s. It came out in 1981, I think. 85. Okay, so the same year as Swamp Thing, actually. So we might be able to make a connection with that, funny enough. And specifically, the passage that I'm asking you to read is part 2 called The Airborne Toxic Event. Okay? Which one chapter in the book. There's a bit of a longer chapter. In my edition, it's 50 pages. So it's a good chunk of a text, right? But it's not so long that you won't be able to read it. That you won't be able to read it before next week. Okay,
Mm.
and we'll kind of unpack some of the elements of it next week. Okay. Any questions before we?
Uh,
Yeah.
I had a question because since we're doing it online, I just wanted to know if I could share my screen. I don't know if it's gonna work because clearly there's been problems.
I don't know. So there's two options. Either you try to share your screen, and if it doesn't work, what we can do, it's not the best thing, but it's better than nothing. You can always send the PowerPoint in the chat, and we can like follow along with you on your PowerPoint from here.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
It'll work.
Yeah, I'll
I'm,
say which page I'm at.
yeah, exactly. Just say like, okay, switch slides, and then we'll all like kind of switch the slide or whatever. So
And
those
you.
are the two options that I can imagine. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, I obviously wasn't expecting Zoom to be a nightmare to use.
Ah,
So, but yeah, any other questions?
Um, about the critical readings,
Mm-hmm.
if I were to look at the Swamp Thing text, and by the end of the passage, the part you wanted us to read, they refer there's like intertextuality about the Francisco Goya's art. And if I want to talk about that with reason,
Absolutely.
would that be okay?
Yeah. Yes. Very much so. Yep.
Okay.
Good. Yeah. I have
Okay.
nothing else to
Yeah.
say. Just yes.
Yeah. No. Perfect.
Okay. Anything else? Beautiful. Thank you very much, and I will see you all next week. Hopefully
Okay.
the
Have a nice
strike will be
week.
over by then. There may be gonna end it on the 15th, so we'll see.
Perfect.
Keep an eye out.
We have hope.
All right, but yeah, have a nice week, everyone. Thanks.
You too. Thanks.
You
Bye.
Bye.
too. Thank you.